Wait a minute. Wait a minute, Doc. Are you telling me that you built a time machine? Out of a DeLorean?
Hey, welcome back to my channel. This is my first video essay in a while, and I'm excited to talk about this movie. I'm only going to be talking about the first movie, Back to the Future 1. I know that I can talk about the rest of the franchise, 2 and 3, but I really want to dive deep into the first one. The film, Back to the Future, is a 1985 film directed by Robert Zemeckis and presented by Steven Spielberg. It stars Michael J. Fox and Christopher Lloyd as Marty McFly and Doc Brown, respectively. The story follows Marty as he is sent back in time from 1985 to 1955 using a time-traveling DeLorean, and his journey on how he gets back to the future. Roll credits, I guess.
In 1985, there lived a young man named Marty McFly.
I wanted to talk about this film and the subject first because it's just a basic story structure that all movies and TV shows and books and in general stories are told, and Back to the Future uses the 3-act structure in such a great way that I really want to talk about today. Back to the Future can have its own film class dedicated to it because of its storytelling masterwork and how the film utilizes the movie's runtime and its use to implement the 3-act structure to its advantage. Now, before we begin with how Back to the Future uses the 3-act structure, we got to learn what the 3-act structure is and where it came from. Way back in the time around 330 BC, the famous philosopher Aristotle wrote Aristotle's Poetics, and in this book he explains the 3-act structure that every good story follows. This is major paraphrasing, by the way. He didn't, that's not word for word. That's not a quote either. It's just major paraphrasing. Way later, in 1978, an author by the name of Sid Field labels 3-act structure as a setup, confrontation, and resolution. This widely renowned and used story structure technique is nothing new, nor is it just an unwritten rule that Hollywood uses in their films. The 3-act structure is a legitimate quote-unquote rule that stories must follow. In the first act, the story follows the viewer/reader to become familiar with the story and the world that they are about to experience. The second act is confrontation, where the actual meat of the story happens. Possibly more characters are introduced, characters take the journey set in front of them, and the landscape of the story is changed. Finally, the third act, the resolution. The climax happens, things are settled, the story comes to a close, and characters get familiar with their new environment. While listening to that explanation of the 3rd-act structure, you probably thought of some movies who try to fit their scenes within the structure. Pretty much every movie follows this pattern, but I'm going to be so daring in saying that Back to the Future does it in the best way, given the movie's runtime.
How far are you going?
About 30 years.
Pretty much every story, or specifically movies, fits into the pattern of 3 acts. There can be an argument that Back to the Future does it the best. The story of the movie fits into the making of that 3-act structure perfectly. Usually the Act 1's of stories are dedicated to setting up plot elements that will be used for specific use later in the story, whether the story deals with time travel or not. In Back to the Future, many elements are set up in the first act that would be perfectly ironed out in a satisfying way just later on in the film. Just to name a few: 1. The very opening long take of all the clocks, setting up the underlying narrative design in the entire film and franchise. Time, or time travel to be specific. 2. Plutonium theft newscast. 3. Skateboarding and using cars to get to destinations, setting up how Marty gets away from the bullies later in 1955. 4. Marty plays the guitar, setting up later scene where he plays the guitar on stage at the school dance in 1955 to get his parents back together. 5. A man hanging on the clock tower, a visual nod to how Doc Brown hangs from the clock tower during the climax of the film. 6. The dialogue between Mr. Strickland and McFly about Marty's dad being a slacker and how history is going to change. 7. Marty and Jennifer are about to kiss until a clock tower activist interrupts them, and what you know, the clock tower is exactly how Marty gets back to the future. 8. Doc Brown says that the Lyon estates and area around it used to be all farmlands, and what do you know? In 1955, it was. 9. Marty's family has this little exchange on how Marty's mom and his dad met about hitting him with a car. And boom, later on, Marty is the one who gets hit. 10. The mayor of Hill Valley is actually the janitor of the shake shop in 1955. All of these setups take place in the first act in just around 30 minutes, within the same time that is dedicated to introducing characters, plot lines, setting, and tone. I swear, Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale were on storytelling crack when writing this film. The average movie runtime is around 2 hours or 120 minutes. And according to the 3-act structure, Act 1 takes about 15% of the movie's runtime. Act 2, being the longest act, takes up about 60 to 70% of the movie's runtime. And the third act runs until the movie is over, clocking in at an average of 15 to 20%. The beginning of Back to the Future takes place in the first act in 1985. Exactly at 31:30, Marty McFly is transported from 1985 to 1955. The second act takes up around 70 minutes because this is where the bulk of the story takes place, and it is set in 1955. If time in 1955 was wrapped up in around 30 or 40 minutes, then the audience would feel we were cheated out of an actual dire situation. Once Marty or the audience is back in 1985, everything from there on out is all different because of the changes Marty made back in time. When you add up all the time that is dedicated in this film to 1985, around the time Act 1 and Act 3 are added up, it clocks in around 40 minutes. That's roughly 35% of the film's runtime. Just about perfect timing for a 15, 70, 20 minute runtime for the 3 acts of a film. Back to the Future uses the 3-act structure not something as to get by, but as a structure for their time traveling story. Every story element can be implemented in a movie setup just for it to be used for a silly gag or joke or no payoff. In Back to the Future, no second is wasted. Even in the opening shot, it's a long take of various types of clocks while the main credits roll and the characters' backstories and hobbies are fleshed out through news articles. Goodness, this movie is so well created.
Let me introduce you to the future.
Back to the Future is a movie that tells a cohesive, fun, interesting story that never loses its tone, feel, and most of all, time. Yes, it is a classic, and very few time-traveling movies have ever come close to matching its storytelling expertise, and even less movies of any genre. Maybe I'm just overanalyzing something that was meant to be experienced on a surface level, but what came out of the writer's room onto the screen in 1985, it inspired me to tell stories and make videos, and will hopefully inspire millions around the world and throughout the rest of time as well. I love Back to the Future, and hopefully this video could maybe influence you to watch it as well, and hopefully the whole entire franchise. As always, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'm curious to what you guys have to say about Back to the Future. Do you love this movie as much as I do, and if so, why? Leave your thoughts down in the comment section, and I'll see you guys in the next video.